One of my questions for you is we've seen a number of data points that are starting to suggest the rest of the world is waking up to us maybe being in a recession. We saw the Fed Now or the Fed GDP or GDP Now, whatever the hell they call the thing, the Atlanta Fed. It went from like, I think it's going to be a positive GDP reading to negative real quick. I think it was last week. What's your take on the time that it takes for us to actually see data points that will give more and more people in the market confidence that we are actually in the recession? Like, it's not like we have real-time data. So how do you think about the time that needs to expire for people to internalize we are headed towards worse and worse financial conditions?
Ooh, that's a great question, man. Big time question. So I'll start by saying the U.S. economy, at least according to Atlanta's Fed's models and other models that are similar nature, nowcasting models, we are in what we call a technical recession in the economics community. That's where you have 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth, headline GDP growth. We are not in an actual recession. And what I mean by actual recession is sort of how the NBER, the National Bureau of Economic Research, defines it. And this is the organization that really determines our recessions. How they define it is sort of a statistically significant downside deviation in output. It could be measured across different industries and industry manufacturing sectors, et cetera, income, et cetera. That is very clearly not happening. If you look at that first chart, I don't know if you got the charts I sent you, but the first chart I sent you is the U.S. economy is not likely in an actual recession yet. And what this chart just shows is our initial jobless claims. Pretty famous statistic. Is this is people applying for unemployment insurance usually after losing their job, and the reality is we're taking up off the lows, but neither the sort of rate of change nor the level would imply that we're actually in a significant decline in labor demand, a significant decline in total employment. So I would dismiss the Atlanta Fed projections as sort of more kind of noise. What will be the real signal is that as we progress throughout Q3 and into Q4 is when measures like initial jobless claims, total employment, non-farm payrolls, when those really start to slow alongside things like PMIs, that'll be your real clear indication that we're actually into or heading into an quote unquote actual recession.
When you see this, is it important, the technical kind of definition? Like, does that actually matter, or does that just give people something to talk about on the internet, but it's less important?
Yeah, 100%. It's just noise. This is what gives people a fodder for FinTwit to go back and forth on what they speculate the Fed may or may not do. But the reality is the Fed, one, is not looking at stuff like, the Atlanta Fed GDP nowcast to determine policy, right? The Fed is looking at, this whole host of large compendium of indicators, particularly focused on inflation and the labor market to determine what that stuff is. And when you look at the labor market, I sent you another chart. The labor market is cooling rapidly, but not rapidly enough. The labor market is still white hot. We are nowhere near a recession in labor market terms, which is clearly one of the main statistics you're going to need to determine if we're in recession. And so what I mean by this, I'll explain the chart. So the light blue bars are sort of where the different metrics, where they averaged throughout 2015, 2019. So kind of the baseline trend. The gray bar is the prior month's data, and the dark blue bar is the most recent month data. I'll draw your eyes to the second cluster of bars and the final cluster of bars. The second cluster of bars just shows the trend in average hourly earnings for the private sector. At 5.6%, we're literally running at a double on a 3-month annualized rate of change basis than we did in on the baseline period, which is the light blue bar. The fourth cluster just shows private sector just sort of aggregate income when you sort of do the product of hours worked, wages, and total employment. At 8% on a 3-month annualized basis, we're more or less a double in terms of where the labor market was running on a trend basis through 2019. So this labor market is not only not in recession, it is basically as growing as fast as it's been in recent years by basically a factor of 2. And so the Fed is paying attention to data like this that's telling you they're eventually going to break. They're going to continue tightening until they break some.
So when I think of the labor market, there's, I don't know, 10 and a half, 11 million open jobs in America, most or around the most that there's ever been. Unemployment is near historic lows, sitting 3.5% or whatever, which still is higher because I think it was 3.4% in February of 2020, if I remember correctly. But generally the same. We saw this week, I think that the data just came out. There was like a 4,000 increase in jobless claims, which was a little bit higher than the consensus was expecting. It came in at like 235,000 or something like that. When you think of all that, the first thing that jumps to mind is, why is there so many open roles? Why is unemployment so low if anecdotally we see companies preparing for recession? They're starting to do hiring freezes. They're starting to do layoffs. Like, is this just we're early in this process and we should expect unemployment to go up? Larry Summers, former Treasury Secretary, claims that we need 5 years of 5+% unemployment to bring inflation down. Like, how do you kind of think about that?
Yeah, that's a very draconian forecast. We're definitely not in that camp. And we certainly don't see the leverage cycle dynamics to get you to an outcome like that. You'd basically have to have the Fed go AWOL in order to get there. But in terms of why there's so many open jobs in the country, one, there's a few reasons, right? We've seen what the economists are calling this sort of quote unquote great resignation, where you've seen a lot of folks who, because of the financial crisis, because of the dot-com bursting of the bubble, they weren't able to retire, or at least according to their initial plan. So they were effectively working for longer than they anticipated. Obviously, we're continuing to have better health outcomes, generally speaking, for most cohorts in the society. So people have been working longer. And so what we've seen is a pretty significant reduction in the labor force participation rate for sort of, the elderly cohorts, 55 plus in this cycle. We've also seen a broad-based reduction in female labor force participation rate as well. Obviously the sort of change in COVID. During COVID, obviously a lot of, females had to help, called upon to help raise kids incrementally with schools being closed, et cetera. But I also think there's another factor to that as well, which is, you have people moving from high cost cities to lower cost residential areas, suburban areas, where you no longer need sort of two whole incomes to support a family. So there's been a significant reduction in the total number of people available at the same time, while the economy is growing on a nominal basis, 8-10%, very quick, very fast. And so clearly companies are scrambling to sort of meet the demand for their customers and new orders, which, by the way, are falling off a cliff if you look at the ISM surveys. So that's why we see this sort of big thing in JOLTS, big sort of lofty level in JOLTS. But there's one chart I did want to sort of conclude with, which is something I think is really important in the context of the Fed's framework, which is the Fed will tighten until it breaks something: labor demand. And this chart just shows the ratio of JOLTS total job openings relative to the total number of unemployed workers. And we're starting to move down, which is what Jay Powell has explicitly called out as something he wants to achieve, which is getting this thing back into equilibrium, which is somewhere around one, job opening per one person unemployed. That would bring, in theory, the labor market into some sort of equilibrium. We're coming off the all-time high there, but we're not moving down fast enough, nor have we achieved a level or a threshold that would tell the Fed that its job is done here. So their job, I think the markets are saying, okay, we're moving in the right direction. Markets tend to function at a rate of change, but the Fed is an academic institution that functions on levels and thresholds. And right now, from a levels/threshold perspective, we are still very hot, very much overheating in the labor market. Again, even looking at this statistic, by a factor of 2.